Okay, everybody. So I'm presenting about containerized applications today. I work for Genesis, and I'm a software engineer. And my name is Marcel Belmont. And what I wanted to talk about today was some Docker concepts. So I actually have a workshop that I did about 10 days ago, and I had some of my members come, and we basically did some, hands-on training, if you will, on the Docker CLI. So if you want to go here, this is the Docker workshop, and I actually have a series of links and a breadcrumb in here. So I kind of explain here, what a container is. And so some of this comes straight from the Docker docs. And if you want to read more about like some of the background on containers, this is a good document. And this repository is, I think it's pretty comprehensive in a sense, it's more than just using Dockerfile, Docker-compose, but I have some examples on Docker Swarm, Docker Machine, some Docker best practices. Some of the advice I actually got from other sources. So for instance, in the Docker best practices, I have a link to another repository. But anyways, for the purposes of today, I just kind of want to quickly go over some of these things. So the Dockerfile is, for the main purpose, is how you build your container. And so in here in the workshop, I kind of have several sections about what the Dockerfile is. And it's basically like a set of instructions to build your container. And you can't build a container with Docker-compose. You have to have a Dockerfile. And so I have two Dockerfiles. So if you want to read more here, there's a link here. And it's pretty long, so it'll probably take you several hours to complete the workshop. And then the last link is the Docker-compose. So the Docker-compose is how you orchestrate all your services, like your database, Redis, your front end, your back end, and that's what I'm going to show you today here. And in here I just have links, so if you've never seen YAML, I have like a little short tutorial on how to use YAML in here. So that will all be provided later in the slides, so you can look at it at your leisure. And so the application architecture is Golang, Vue.js, MongoDB, and Redis. And the application orchestration with Docker, there's two Docker files. And the first Docker file basically builds the front end. It builds what essentially runs Webpack Dev Server. And then the second Docker file is where I actually get the API, the backend. And I'm going to show you that here in a second. And the docker-compose YAML script will orchestrate the actual different services. We'll actually link the backend with the database and Redis. And I'm going to show you how to actually get into your container, interrogate it, how to actually ping inside, see the IP address that it provides. We'll be doing that shortly. And so the entry point for the backend is one source, and it's main.go, but the main.go actually loads other files. So there's a one dependency that I have, actually two, Redis and a library called Redigo. And it's quite different than Node.js, where you just crack open your Node modules and you see a billion different modules. It's not like that in Golang, which is something that I'm beginning to really like. But in my Node modules, I do have one in the front end. There's quite a bit of libraries that I'm using for Vue.js. And there's two actually scripts. So this go run main, so inside here, I'll show you. So you're not going to see it in the dockerfile.go, but I actually have this npm script called dev docker. And so inside dev docker, what that runs is it runs Webpack Dev Server. That's when the container is built. And then inside the Docker-compose, and we're going to talk about that in a second, there's this command that runs the main and the data that I provide. And now for the demo. And there's quite a bit, so I'm going to try to get straight into it. So the first thing that I'm going to try to do is we're just going to write a test in Golang. All right. So the first thing I'm going to do is I actually have this file, and what I'm going to do is it in Redis. So in Redis in here, see if anybody can see this, I have a bunch of different functions. And if you've never seen Golang, it's a little bit different. But I'm just going to go ahead and just dive in here and write this first function. So right now what I'm going to implement is a function called delete key. So what I'm actually doing in here is I'm just writing the function, and if you can see some of the errors that I'm returning, this is quite helpful. In Visual Studio Code, it's actually, what it's telling me is it's linting for me as I'm typing. So if you saw some of those squiggly lines, it's very helpful. And I actually will import the packages when I just type and save. So here's my function. All right. So we're going to go in here. We're going to write a test for it. And so in Golang, you don't actually have to import get a test runner to actually run your test. It's built into the language. And so right now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a key, delete it, and then check it, and then see if it actually exists, if it's nil. So I actually have a command in here called setKey. So if you look in here, this takes a key. It takes whatever data you're going to give to it. So for my purposes, it will be a string, and then and doesn't return anything, so that's why it closes it. And so here what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a key. I'm going to call it do stuff, and then blah 1. Okay, not very useful, but just for the test purposes. And then here I'm going to actually call another function, and then this will take 2 arguments, and then it's called getKey. So, all right. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to check, what you always do in Golang is you check the actual error. So after, if anything returns an error, that's the next statement that you check. And so for this purposes, T, which is a pointer here, actually has this function called error. And you can actually have, if you're familiar with the printf function, you can actually format your errors. So if this was an error here, then it, did not get the key. Okay. And then now I'm just going to print the actual value. So here we'll put in val. Redis.string, reply, and the error. Not checking anything here. See, this is what I like about it, is actually it's highlighting it, it's things that have been going. And in VS Code, you can actually install the Golang server. So if you notice in here, I can see what parameters go in here and what the return is, which is very useful. And so right here, it's yelling at me again. It says val declared not used, error declared not used. Okay. And then so here we're just I'm gonna check the error again. Okay. And then we're going to see this squiggly line, val declared, so it's just complaining about that again. And then for this purposes, we'll just print it. Okay, so that goes away. Now we're going to delete it. So for the delete, if you remember, it actually returns, I'm returning the reply and the error. So we'll just test that out here again. So reply 2, error 3. It's just complaining about not being used again. Alright, so okay. So let's just run this test. So in Golang, what you do is this is all in packages. So one thing I didn't mention is I have a model, I have a Redis package, I have a handlers, which is basically where all of the REST calls will go, and I have a routes. We'll talk about that in a second. I'm going to cd into the Redis package, and then I'm going to run my test. And if it doesn't fail, it's going to return the actual string. So here it says log1, which is the actual key, and then the value. And then it passes. So I like that because that's a lot easier than doing stuff in Node.js when you have to install different libraries for just to test something. All right. So the next thing I want to actually go over is to do just test real quickly, show you what Ava.js. And so in the front end, I have something called source. And if you look under here, I have this component. So this component is kind of like if you've seen React.js. What you do is you have a template, you have a script, and you have a styles. And for all intents and purposes, this is just a component. It's just encapsulated. And I have another component here called the index view. And so you can write ES6 inside here. And one of the cool things about Vue is that it's much like React, but you don't have JSX, and it's not like a one-to-one mapping, but you have a lot of things that are like really cool that you can get in React. And so, for instance, in Vue you can use Vuex. I didn't hook it up, but if you want to fork this repo, you can hook that up. And so, what I'm going to do real quickly is inside I have a test directory for all the front end stuff. So you go to the component. And one thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to show you real quickly how we're going to test our add user. Alright, so we're going to remove the snapshot here. So if you're familiar with Jest, this is just like Jest except we're using Ava. Okay. Got to get out of CD back up. So what I'm doing here is what happens is when it runs the component, it'll get a snapshot and it'll build the DOM and it'll compare it. So that's what it's called, a snapshot. It's actually comparing it to make sure that your component rendered correctly. So what we're going to do here is inside we have a component called index test. So if you've ever seen Ava, this is my favorite testing library whenever I do any kind of Node.js or front end. I think it's a very clean library to use. We're just going to copy this file real quick and make the appropriate changes. So I'm going to make a file called adduser.test.js. Okay, we're going to copy the contents and adjust accordingly. So if you notice here, what you do is, I don't need to mock anything out because I don't have any functions. And this is called add user. Okay. And then I'm going to delete this part over here. I'm going to take the sandbox because it's sign on. I'm going to delete this. Okay. We're going to call this add user component. Okay. We're going to delete this template because it's actually different. We're going to copy what the template is. So this is the markup. So we're going to copy this. We're going to paste it. Alright. And then we're going to delete this part because we don't have any data. We're just going to pass it in. It's like, if you look at it in React, it's like passing in your props. Okay? And so what we're going to do here is we can just pass in the props. And so the props that it actually takes, if you look under here in add user, it takes in an add user label. And this will be passed in from index view. Okay? And then we're going to give it the props data, which is an object. Okay. We're just going to pass in add user. Alright. This is complaining because we haven't used it yet. We're going to delete this. So you have these helper functions in Ava. And then we're going to change this to be add user component. Whenever you're using Vue and you have asynchronous actions, you want to wrap things in something called the next tick. And if you don't do that, what's going to happen is your test is going to run, but like when it takes the snapshot, it's not going to have any of the markup because it has to, that's what the whole purpose of the next tick is. So we're going to take that out because this is more like a dumb component. It just has information passed into it. We're going to save it. Notice there's no snapshot in there now. Now, if you just want to run that single test, you do /node modules.bin ava test component add user test. And if it passes, it's going to just say pass. So that's going to say render the index component. But notice something in here. It generated something called a .snap. So if you look inside here, this actually rendered that component. And you see that information pass add user? So it did a snapshot and it compared it. And so one of the reasons why is this guy even doing the test is I really like to, I don't follow like strict TDD, but I think it's good because it really helps you, slim down your implementation and kind of think about the problem. And so one of the reasons I like doing this testing library is I can actually look at my components and kind of not make too many guesses. So that's it for some of that part of the demo. So the next thing I want to do is actually go over Docker. So remember that I told you that there are some entry points. Now in terms of Docker, this npm scripts, this is actually how I run my Docker container. Okay, so I have a bunch of different scripts in here, and so if you notice, I actually have a bunch of them that have docker-compose. So that's part of the Docker CLI. Okay, and I have two Docker files themselves. So one is where I actually build the first container. So if you notice, I have something called Alpine Node. Now that's a 3.98 megabyte Linux distribution. And I think when you add Node and all the other dependencies, it's about like 39 megabytes. If you don't do that, what you're going to have is a huge image, like the default one's like 500 megabytes. So once you start doing Docker, you're going to start seeing it takes up a lot of space eventually. So I like to use Alpine because it's stripped down, basically the most bare bone Linux you can get. And so in my Docker workshop, if you check out later, you're going to see how some of these keywords work, like label, just labeling the actual maintainer. Here I'm setting up an environment variable. Here I'm actually installing. And then your best practices, you're going to want to run one runs instruction. And the reason you want to do that is because the more you do, the bigger their image will be. And I have that under the Docker best practices. And so what's happening here is I'm actually making a directory in the container. I'm copying the package JSON, and I'm putting it into the container's file path. I'm running npm install, running npm Node SAS. The reason why I do that is because a lot of times it breaks it. I don't know if you ever use Node SAS, but if you switch versions of Node, it'll complain and scream at you. So I just force it to just rebuild Node SAS. And then there's the script. And then here's the dockerfile.go. And so what this does is it gets at that time it was the latest Golang. I think Golang 1.9 is coming out. But anyways, it's the same kind of idea, except now this is the backend. So you see the backend is getting built now. And so I have kind of mapped the same tree structure, except this is, for all intents and purposes, an isolated environment. This is the other container. And so here I'm installing other packages. So you notice here I have Gore, I have the Gorilla Toolkit, I have something called the Gorilla Handlers, and I have several other things in here. Okay, and so what happens is I actually run this all in the terminal. So what I do here is when you say, what I do is I do npm run build. So just to show you a little trick, if you do npm run, I'll show you all your scripts. And so the script that I'm actually going to run is going to be build. And so what that does under the hood is it runs docker-compose build, and what that does is it builds the two containers. So let's do that so you can see it. Okay, and so I want you to notice something here. If you see here, it's saying Redis image skipping, DB, which is Mongo skipping, test.go uses an image skipping, test using an image skipping, building the backend. Remember I told you that was Golang? This is building the Golang container. And so what it does is if you look at the set of instructions, this is coming from the Dockerfile that I've specified and has these steps. Okay? And once this gets done, it goes to the next container, which is the front end. Okay? And so one thing that you're going to see is I've already pre-built this, so it shouldn't take as long as it took for the first time I built it when you delete it. So if you notice in here, I have several images. So I have two that I created myself and some other ones here. So if you look at it here, I have Redis, Node, I have my world, this is for the workshop. I have one called Hello World, Docker Apache 2, Docker Git, Nginx. And so that's where all your images are, right? Now, the container is still not running. So when this finishes, what's going to happen is I'm going to run another command that's going to actually spin up those two containers. And then I'm going to interrogate and I'm going to show you what's happening. We're going to actually get the application running. I'm going to add a user and then delete a user. So if you notice in here, all these instructions are still going. It takes a second to do this. And I did this kind of on purpose so you would see it. It takes a couple minutes sometimes to build, and because there's multiple container files, it takes a little bit longer. But what you're going to see online is there's not, I didn't see a whole lot of documentation on this part. So while that's going, I'm going to show you something. This is for all intents and purposes, how everything gets orchestrated. This is Docker Compose version 3. Okay, so this runs this MongoDB command. It mounts a data volume, and so if you don't have a data volume in Docker, anytime you blow away your container, everything's gone. So you have to have a data volume if you want to have persistence. And then if you notice in here, I have two different ports. This first one is the host port. The second one is the actual container port. And then I have another service here called front end, and all that does is builds the Node.js front end. And so you can pass environment variables, and I'm going to show you how that once we get the container running. And then here's just another volume. Restart always. Well, what will happen is it'll just continuously restart the actual container, which is very useful because you don't want it to just blow up and die. So that's another trick that I have. And so if you notice, there's another one called links. This links to backend. Now, the backend has a lot of knowledge, so there's two links for it. It has the database and Redis. So when we actually go into the backend, we're going to be able to ping both the database and Redis. So this should be almost done. So if you notice, it took a while. Finally built. All right, so now we're going to run the container. npm run dev. All right. And so what you would notice, if I had built this the first time, it would have said it's pulling the actual image. I already have the images, so it actually just skipped that step and just created those containers. So if you notice, these are different outputs. One is Redis, another one is the front end. And so I'm going to just get the nice, well, it's somewhat nice. We're going to get the front end going here. And that's mapped to localhost 8080. And so this is a simple application. There's just a list of users. So, and it's not sorted. But we're going to do the first call. It's going to go to the endpoint that I've designated as add user. So here we're going to add in a user, 51, Wonder Woman, female, and then Wonder Woman at superhero.net. Okay? And so if you look, I added it as the last part. And I'm not using Vue.js, so I actually did a little bit state manage it myself. And so I'm going to show you now the front end for Vue. How that actually worked is in Vue.js, I actually am using a library called the Vue resource. And all that does is I've actually made my own utilities for the making an AJAX request. But this request actually happened right here. So if you notice in here, I added that user. I made a REST call here that maps to API v1 add user. Okay, I'm not using Vuex. All I basically did is for all intents and purposes for Vue, you use the data. Data is how you have your state management. And so here, that's where some of that's getting rendered. And so on the front end here, if you've seen, Angular 1, this is kind of seems a little bit like Angular 1 a little bit. But all I'm doing is looping through those users that I've got from the back end. And so let me show you the back end. So the back end, how that works is there's a main.go. And so in the main.go, this is like the source keeper, if you want to think of it. This is where I kind of get Redis fired up, I get the database, and I get everything spawned. And so if you notice here, I'm initializing Redis, I'm getting MongoDB set up, and I'm having the HTTP server listening. And it's listening at port 3001. And so why that's important is I have a file called webpack-config.js. And so that actually, I have a proxy here. So the endpoint is API. And that maps to the back end. So if you notice in here, I didn't call this localhost. That maps to the back end, which was declared in Docker-compose. So that's what you do when you use Docker. You actually use these name of services, but it actually maps to an IP address. And I'll show you that in a second. And so the next command, all I do is I have remove user. So I'll just remove Wonder Woman. And she's gone. But I want to show you something. So we're going to add her back. So actually we'll add somebody else. So we'll do Chuck Norris. Okay. Mail chuck.norris at highkicker.net. Okay. So we're going to add Chuck Norris. So now we're going to go into the container. This is running, and I actually logged out some things. So now let's actually go into MongoDB. So how you do that is you do docker-compose exec, and then you name the service. So for our services, it's going to be DB, and then the shell, which you could do it like this. But I'm just going to do shell. Now we're going to go into Mongo. We're going to show the database. So we have admin Docker and local. We're going to use Docker, and then we're actually going to find Chuck Norris. Okay, users.find ID 51. This should return Chuck Norris, but actually return more because I have more. So I have Wonder Woman and I have Chuck Norris. And the reason why I did that is because I didn't clean that up, but I just wanted you to see that. And then now we're going to go to the next container. So we're going to go into docker-compose exec. We're going to Redis. And now we're going to the Redis CLI. So these are all the actual keys that I've set for Redis. Okay? And so now if we want to just get the keys for 51, so there should be a key here. 51. Let's see. Okay. No, we deleted it. Okay. So now we're just going to get 50. So hget all. So if you've ever done Redis, there's some really nice documentation how to use it. So we'll just get user 49. So if you see it has an ID 50, and then the first name Jonathan, And that's actually, think about it like an array. 49 is actually at position 50. And then you have Jonathan Carpenter, and then his name. Now remember I told you that we can actually interrogate and ping the IP address. So I'm going to exit out of here. Give that a second. Okay. Alright, so now we're going to go into the back end. Backend shell. And we're going to ping DB. Okay, whatever happens. Oh, we're running out of time? Ah, okay. So it must have locked up. Okay, so if that actually worked, sorry Tracy. So if that actually worked, that would show the IP address as it's running. And so yeah, let me go back to the slide so I can finish up. So that was the demo. If you want to find me, I'm jbellman at GitHub. I'm jbellman80 on Twitter. This is Code Craftsmanship Saturdays. You can click these links. And questions. Does anybody have a question? No? No having time? Panel? Okay. All right.